Empires are like chess masters on the global board. Every strategy they execute reverberates through history, yet sometimes even the most powerful miscalculate. Today we examine a chronicle where America attempted to wound India, but in doing so paid a price heavier than it ever imagined. When America looked at India, it saw only reflections of the past. It saw poverty, it saw struggle, it saw a nation still building itself piece by piece, still learning how to balance democracy and development, still working through the scars of history. In their eyes, India was a country that could be managed, pressured, and manipulated, a country whose rise could be slowed down, controlled, or even stopped. They thought India was too fragmented, too diverse, too noisy to ever truly stand tall on the world stage. And that arrogance, that miscalculation, became the seed of America's greatest mistake. Because what they failed to understand was this: India's strength was never in being polished or perfect. India's power was never about neat statistics or clean lines on a graph. India's strength has always been its resilience, the ability to endure storms, survive famines, withstand invasions, and yet still rise again and again stronger each time. America misread that spirit. They thought they could press a few economic buttons, impose a few trade restrictions, and push India into a corner. But every corner that India has ever been pushed into has become the birthplace of its greatest comebacks. When sanctions were placed, India turned inward, building its own industries, investing in its own talent, and nurturing innovation within its borders. When America tried to block India's access to certain technologies, India didn't break, it adapted, it innovated. It found solutions where none seemed possible. That is the beauty of resilience. When the world closes its doors, a determined nation builds its own. And India built brick by brick, code by code, invention by invention. What was meant to suffocate became a spark for self-reliance. What was meant to weaken became the very fire that hardened the steel of India's resolve. You see, the greatest miscalculation was not in the sanctions or the pressure. It was in underestimating the Indian mind, because in every village, in every city, in every classroom across the nation, a generation was rising. They had tasted the humiliation of being underestimated, and they were determined to prove the world wrong. They worked silently, they worked relentlessly, and when the world wasn't watching, they built companies, they built satellites, they built technologies, and they built a vision that was larger than any foreign judgment of them. America thought India could be slowed down. Instead, India accelerated, and what did America not see? They did not see the billion-strong heartbeat of a nation that has endured for thousands of years. They did not hear the quiet whispers of farmers who knew how to survive droughts, the engineers who knew how to create with nothing but scrap, the teachers who could spark brilliance in classrooms without electricity. They did not recognize that resilience was not a political slogan in India. It was DNA. It was the very fabric of the culture. So when America tried to use pressure, it only fueled determination. When they tried to impose limits, India turned those limits into challenges. And every time America said, "You cannot," India answered, "Watch us." And the world did watch. They watched as India, once struggling to launch a single satellite, put dozens into orbit in a single mission. They watched as India, once dismissed as too poor to matter, became the fastest growing major economy in the world. They watched as India, once seen as a follower, began to lead in technology, in diplomacy, in vision. But perhaps the greatest irony of all was this: America believed India's diversity was its weakness. They saw 1 billion people speaking hundreds of languages, practicing dozens of faiths, living in countless different traditions. And they thought this country cannot hold together. They thought India would break under its own weight. Yet that very diversity became the anchor of its strength, because where others saw chaos, India saw possibility. Where others saw division, India saw democracy. Where others predicted collapse, India discovered unity in diversity, and that unity became unshakable. And so with every attempt to press down on India, America revealed not India's fragility, but its fortitude. They revealed that this nation was not a puppet to be controlled, but a power to be respected. They revealed that India could not be measured by Western frameworks, because India was playing a longer game, a game rooted in centuries, not election cycles. And slowly America realized that every move they made to weaken India was in fact strengthening it. Every time they tried to remind India of its place, India redrew the map. Every time they tried to bend India's will, India bent the arc of history. What America underestimated most was not the government, not the policies, not even the military. It was the people. 1 billion ordinary people with extraordinary endurance. The shopkeeper who works 16 hours a day to put his children through school. The farmer who wrestles with unpredictable monsoons and still feeds millions. The scientist who stays up night after night coding, experimenting, inventing. These are not just citizens. They are the silent soldiers of a nation's rise. And no sanction, no pressure, no foreign power could ever crush that will. So the first great truth became undeniable. You cannot wound a nation whose identity is resilience. You cannot control a people whose spirit is freedom. You cannot break a civilization that has already endured centuries of storms and still stands unshaken. America tried to hurt India, but instead they gave it the greatest gift of all, the fire to prove itself. The more they doubted India, the stronger India became. The more they pushed, the further India leapt. And the more they tried to confine India to the shadows, the brighter India's light burned on the world stage. This was the great underestimation, and it cost America dearly. When a superpower makes a move, it expects the world to tremble. America believed it had mastered this art. Decades of dominance had taught it that when it pressed, others bent. When it spoke, others obeyed. When it punished, others begged for forgiveness. But what happens when the target refuses to yield? What happens when the blow that was meant to weaken becomes the very force that awakens? That is where America miscalculated, and that is where it paid the price. For every action, there is a consequence. And when America tried to weaken India, the consequences ricocheted back, not only stripping away its influence, but also rewriting the balance of global power. Because power, you see, is not simply about wealth or military might. It is about credibility, trust, and respect. America, in its arrogance, did not realize that the moment it tried to sabotage India, the world was watching. And the world does not respect a giant that bullies. The world respects resilience, self-reliance, and courage. And it was India, not America, that embodied those virtues when the storm came. The first price America paid was in its reputation. Every attempt to isolate India only revealed the insecurity of a superpower unwilling to share the stage. When sanctions were imposed, countries that had quietly stood in America's shadow began to question its motives. They saw the truth that the punishment was not about principles, but about fear. Fear of India's rise, fear of India's independence, fear of a world where decisions were not dictated by Washington, but shared among equals. And as America tried to push India down, other nations leaned in closer, offering hands of partnership. Russia saw opportunity. Asian neighbors saw a partner. Africa, Latin America, Europe, they all saw that India was not folding under pressure, but standing taller. The harder America pressed, the more the world respected India. That was the first great loss for America, credibility. The second price was in influence. Once America's words were commands, but with India that grip loosened. America would say, do not buy oil here, and India would buy. America would say, do not ally there, and India would ally. America would say, do not build this, and India would build anyway. And with every act of defiance, others took note. Nations long tired of American lectures suddenly saw in India a symbol, a living proof that you could stand tall, say no, and still thrive. India became the beacon for multipolarity, the idea that the world does not need one master but many voices. And as this idea spread, America's influence shrank. Its word no longer carried the same weight because one nation had shown that it could be challenged and that challenge could succeed. The third prize was economic. America thought restricting India would harm Indian growth. But what happened? India turned eastward, forged new trade corridors, invested in domestic production, and diversified its partnerships. Technology that America tried to withhold was replaced by innovation born at home or sourced from new allies.
Supply chains that were meant to choke India only pushed it to create alternatives, and in time those alternatives began to threaten American dominance itself. Indian software, Indian pharmaceuticals, Indian satellites, Indian energy strategies, they were no longer dependent on the American hand. And in some areas they began to compete directly. What was meant to weaken a rival ended up strengthening a competitor.
But perhaps the deepest price America paid was in its own self-image. For generations, it had seen itself as the champion of democracy, the defender of freedom. But when it tried to suppress India, a democracy of a billion voices, it revealed hypocrisy. It showed that its values were selective, applied when convenient, discarded when challenged, and that hypocrisy was not lost on the world. Nations remembered, leaders remembered, people remembered. America's moral high ground began to crumble while India's moral authority began to rise. For how could a nation born of independence, a nation that had endured colonialism, a nation that had lifted itself without conquest, how could such a nation not capture the admiration of billions when it stood up to the greatest power of the age? And yet the irony is sharp. America thought it was playing a game of dominance. In truth, it was accelerating the very transformation it feared most. Every attempt to isolate India only pushed India to deepen alliances with Russia, China, the Middle East, and the global South. Every effort to cut off resources only forced India to innovate. From renewable energy to defense to digital economies, every strike meant to slow India only quickened its pace. By trying to deny India a seat at the table, America built a new table, one where India sat at the head. History always punishes arrogance. The British Empire learned this when it underestimated India's fight for independence. The Soviet Union learned this when it underestimated the will of nations who refused its grip. And America is learning this when it underestimates India's resilience. The price of arrogance is always the same: decline. And that decline begins not with explosions or wars, but with credibility slipping through your fingers, influence draining away, respect evaporating. America tried to hurt India, but in the process, it revealed its own fragility. The lesson is profound. Power is not about how many allies you can control. It is about how many respect you willingly. Power is not about punishing others. It is about inspiring them. And when America chose punishment, it lost inspiration. When it chose coercion, it lost trust. When it chose fear, it lost respect. India did not have to fight with bombs or guns. Its weapon was endurance. Its shield was dignity. And those proved mightier than America's threats. The price America paid will echo for years, because now the world knows India cannot be broken. Now the world has seen sanctions cannot silence innovation. Now the world has learned pressure cannot erase democracy. America tried to hurt India, but instead it planted the seeds of India's inevitable rise. Seeds that are now blooming across technology, across diplomacy, across every field where resilience is greater than dominance. And perhaps the greatest cost for America was this: it lost the chance to be a true partner. It could have walked alongside India as an equal, building a world of shared progress. It could have embraced India's rise as a force for stability, prosperity,